Welcome back to Institut Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellations of Francesc Tosquelles. We thank you for joining us for the third and final part of today's program in this second panel titled From Disalienating to Decarcerating Mental Illness in the United States. We will hear from Martin Summers, the Greene Clinic, Fontaine House, and Liat Ben-Moshe. The second panel of the day examines the ways in which Tosquelles' politicized ideas and practices of psychiatry resonates with the search for disability justice in the American context. A quick reminder that closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and there will be time for Q&A with everyone at the end of the panel, so you can share your questions throughout the talks using the Q&A feature of the chat. Our moderator for the second panel is Edward Dioguardi, Tosquelles exhibition co-curators, who recently served as Anthony Petullo Foundation and Weiler Curatorial Fellow at EFAM. Hi, Edward. So nice to see you on the screen. And now I'll hand it over to you and to our panelists.
Always. Thank you, Matilda. Appreciate it. Once again, my name is Edward Dioguardi. I'm going to be giving an introduction today. I, along with Valerie Russo, Joan Masso, and Carlos Guerra, is one of the co-curators of the exhibition. And I think what we really try to do in adapting Tosquelles' exhibition to AFAM in New York City is to situate him and his legacy in relation to the history of mental health and its corresponding institutions in the United States. Because given the novelty of Tosquelles' thought, it's kind of fitting that the mental health in these institutions in the United States are themselves marked by a paradoxical sort of condition, because in popular discourse, while the specter of like early 20th century asylum horrors looms large in the public imagination, mental health institutions and state asylums are largely defunded and also decried to a certain extent in some discourse. Some argue an asylum system effectively does not exist. Others argue that a system of asylum never existed beyond punitive ends and see institutionalization as an effectively fake resolution to problems that are primarily political and economic in nature. The triumph of pharmacology in the last 30 years and widespread availability of prescription psychiatric drugs constituted a watershed in the timeline of asylums' decline. This key word for Tosquelles is asylum in relation to the village of Saint Alban, and against the background of larger struggles in the field of healthcare, efforts toward new institutional forms for the treatment of mental health in the U.S. often run aground a view of institutionalization has gone too far, not enough, or institutionalization, and in what way. We've already very nicely kind of inherited some questions from the previous panel that we'll get at much of the content of what we'll get into today. But the history of U.S. institutions is not without attempts to reshape treatment of mental health, let alone the notion of mental health and mental illness itself. It's always been subject to critical inquiries for a long time, and maybe since the beginning of this history. And in concert with American life writ large, the history of U.S. mental institutions is arguably comprised of clashing utopian, or anti-utopian, or emancipatory, and let's say counter-emancipatory tendencies, with the more emancipatory ones sharing some strong affinities, I think, with Tosquelles' vision of an asylum village. So considered with respect to Tosquelles' life's work and its legacy, I think these sort of overlooked emancipatory or utopian moments of U.S. history maybe appear from new perspective, and especially with regards to what we'll hear from our panelists today. I'm going to begin by introducing all of our panelists at once, slightly different than how we did it on the last panel, because I want to make some very brief comments on the exhibition that will kind of hopefully set in motion some questions later after we hear some talks in the Q&A. So first, our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Martin Summers. He's a professor of history in African and African diaspora studies at Boston College. He's the author of Manliness and Its Discontents, Black Middle Class and the Transformation of Masculinity, 1900 and 1930 from 2004. and the co-editor of Precarious Prescriptions, Contested Histories of Race and Health in North America from 2014. His most recent book, Madness in the City of Magnificent Intentions, A History of Race and Mental Illness in the Nation's Capital, from 2019, received the Cherion Society's Prize for an outstanding monograph in the history of behavioral and social sciences. And Summers is currently at work on a book, Inner City Blues, African-American Mental Health and the Urban Crisis in 20th Century Chicago, which examines how social scientists, psychiatrists, and psychiatric social workers, government officials, and community activists understood the relationship between urbanization and mental illness, and consequently sought to address the mental health care needs of African Americans in so-called ghettos. His talk today is going to be entitled Threading the Therapeutic Needle, Race, Racism, and Psychiatric Treatment at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Founded in 1855, the Federal Insane Asylum St. Elizabeth's Hospital was one of the first mental hospitals in the American South to have an appreciably racially heterogeneous patient population prior to desegregation efforts in the post-World War II era, says Dr. Summers. And on the one hand, while St. Elizabeth's psychiatrists affirmed their commitment to their medical professional tenets by providing care for mentally ill African Americans, on the other hand, this largely conformed to the racist mores of the day, which asserted fundamental difference and inferiority of Blacks and dictated the separation of the races. And all of this being threaded together by a therapeutic logic, he will argue, one that drew on and reinforced dominant cultural ideas about the American racial order. After this talk, our next speakers will be the Greene Clinic in Fountain House today, from whom we have Dr. Loren Dent, Dr. Matthew Oyer, and Dr. Christopher Landry. The Greene Clinic is a sliding scale psychotherapy practice based in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. A team of psychologists, social workers, counselors, and psychiatrists that provides high-quality mental health care, including individual therapy for adults and children, relationship therapy, group therapy, and psychological assessment. Fountain House is a mental health clubhouse in New York City, a therapeutic community founded by and for people with serious mental illness to support one another in recovery, to find and develop strengths, and to live a personally satisfying life. Dr. Loren Dent is a clinical psychologist in private practice, co-director of the training program at the Greene Clinic. Formerly, he was the team leader at the first episode psychosis program. He's an instructor at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, an editor of Division Review, psychoanalytic publication of the American Psychological Association, and he's also a board member of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis. Dr. Matthew Oyer is a licensed psychologist and psychoanalyst, co-director at the Greene Clinic, assistant clinical professor at the Kahn School of Medicine, and adjunct supervising faculty in the clinical psychology doctoral program at City College. He completed his doctoral training at the City University of New York and his doctoral internship at the New York Psychoanalytic Society Institute, or NYPSI, and the Mount Sinai Medical Center. With a small group of others, Dr. Oyer created and implemented a program of independent psychoanalytic training through which he continues to pursue lifelong formation. And he has experience working in a wide range of settings, from inpatient psychiatric units and intensive hospital-based outpatient programs to therapeutic communities, substance abuse treatment facilities, university counseling centers, and outpatient mental health clinics. And he's also a board member of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis, and he's on the editorial board of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. Dr. Christopher Landry is a psychiatrist at Fountain House, member. He had trained at Columbia University for medical school and psychiatry residency, and he currently serves as public psychiatry fellow at Columbia University and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Their talk today, collectively, will be called Constellations, Psychosis in the City. In the wake of several cities implementing policies to expand forced hospitalizations, their presentation is going to return to the discoveries of institutional psychotherapy and sector psychiatry to imagine possibilities of renewed anti-carceral psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis in the city. Moreover, the presentation is going to aim to honor the inheritance of institutional psychotherapy with Tosquelles through extending these concepts from the hospital to the city, from post-war France to the contemporary American setting. And after introducing this conceptualization, he'll present and describe a new treatment for psychosis here in Brooklyn, New York, the Constellation program at the Greene Clinic. For our finale, we'll have Dr. Liat Ben-Moshe, who's an interdisciplinary scholar activist working at the intersection of disability, madness, incarceration, decarceration, and abolition. She's the author of Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization, and Prison Abolition from the University of Minnesota Press in 2020, and the co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the United States and Canada from Palgrave in 2014. Dr. Ben-Moshe is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Today, her talk will be entitled Decarcerating Madness, Genealogies of Deinstitutionalization and Reinstitutionalization. She's going to ask, are asylums behind us, and how might racial criminal pathologization used historically in contempt, how is it used historically and now to control? And in the process, we'll also argue that deinstitutionalization is the largest decarceration movement and process in US history. So altogether, I personally am very excited for this panel, just to riff for a second, because I think it aligns closely with the positions that we tried to outline curatorially in the exhibition. You'll see here, if Mathilde, you could please bring me to the next slide. Thank you. You'll see here some works from the last section of our exhibition, which was entirely works from US artists. I could go on more a little bit about them in histories, but there's more earlier works in this section kind of address often the topic of the structure of asylums and this history, I think, that then leads into the period of deinstitutionalization and sort of a reopening of this history from the perspective of the individual that took place much later on, but is maybe closer to our contemporary sensibility. If Mathilde, you could send me to the next slide also, that would be great. I just want to highlight quickly two works here. One is this horse dress on the left. In particular, I wanted to share it because it'll give you a sense of the widespread context of the phenomena we're going to discuss today. It's from the Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital in Baltimore, which was founded in 1853, largely, basically contemporaneously with the St. Elizabeth's Hospital that Dr. Summers is going to talk about today. And also on the right is similar embroidery type work, often embroidered works where the province of female patients in psychiatric hospitals in the mid-20th century. They were not necessarily considered artworks per se, but they kind of arrived to us today through having been found in usually contingent ways. The work on the right is a coat by an artist we know as Merlin. It took a lot of research to reconstruct this, but she was a patient at the Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital near Knoxville, Tennessee. She had entered there and was committed in 1948. At the age of 28, she apparently had schizophrenic symptoms, but found a sort of respite from this and amidst very cruel treatment that's reported by researchers in working on various embroideries, only two of which remain today, one of which we're exhibiting. You'll see, if you look closely at the exhibition, that there's all sorts of text written all over it, a kind of glossolalia. But what's very interesting is that these phrases and names do not necessarily refer to any personal details from the patient's life, but instead seem to refer overwhelmingly to cultural ideas about politics, so even community, and even like television references from the time period. Merlin was actually one of the earliest Americans to receive Thorazine, the first antipsychotic medication, and upon receiving this, she stopped sewing and all of her embroidery work. And Thorazine is largely considered to mark a big transition towards the institutionalization that was pursued afterward on the basis of the idea that maybe the country could do without institutions now, insofar as there's instead this biochemical sort of solution. And I think I'm mentioning this work because I think it's a good microcosm of the history and the type of questions we're going to address today, the perspectives on the asylum, because Dr. Summers is going to talk about history and maybe presuppositions behind this very idea of asylum. The Greene Clinic and Fountain House are going to talk about attempts to apply this in the contemporary age, where this is more driven from the standpoint of the individual and treatment, maybe more than this actual asylum sort of containment model, and different models of transference, as we discussed in the earlier panel, or burst transference, and what this might look like. And then finally, Dr. Ben-Moshe is going to address, I think, kind of the ghost of this asylum model, its persistence amidst the contemporary phenomena and treatment of mental health. And so I think it forms a really beautiful loop, the topics of our panelists today and how they're going to weave into each other. And so without further ado, I want to quote our previous moderator, give the screen is yours, Dr. Summers.
Yeah, thank you, Edward, for really kind of tying our papers together. And I want to also thank Matilda and the conference organizers for inviting me to present. So I'm here today. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend any of the earlier panels because it's our final day of the semester, so I was busy teaching, and I'm not quite sure if any reference to St. Elizabeth's has been made yet. I gather that Tosquelles had some relationship with St. Elizabeth's or someone on the clinical staff. But I'm going to be talking about the kind of racial segregation and also, to a lesser extent, integration at St. Elizabeth's, and how it fit into this larger kind of therapeutic logic that was very much shaped by ideas about racial difference. So I want to begin by just talking very briefly, giving a little historical background on St. Elizabeth's. Edward already mentioned a little bit. It was established in 1855 with a mandate to house and treat insane soldiers and sailors, as well as civilian residents of Washington, D.C., who were too poor to afford private treatment. And the image that I'm showing here is a very early drawing of the hospital, and with the original title of the name. Actually, the original title of the name was Government Hospital for the Insane of the Army and Navy and the District of Columbia. And it's classic mid-19th century asylum. Architectural style is collegiate Gothic, and it was part of the Kirkbride architectural style of asylums, in the sense that you started with center building, and then as you added wings on to the center building, the new wing was offset to its antecedent footprint. And you can see this a little more clearly in the next two images that I have. At its peak, St. Elizabeth's housed approximately 8,000 patients. And this is, I should also say, that's located in the southeast quadrant of Washington, D.C., which would eventually become a predominantly African-American section of the city. And here, again, is an aerial view of the hospital in the 1970s, with the center building, which I just showed in the previous image, located towards the bottom center of the photo. And you can kind of see the tiered footprint of the center building, which was built in 1855. And then most of the wards that were built over the ensuing decades are you can identify them by the red tiled roofs. So this was an incredibly large hospital. And it was also considered a preeminent research and teaching hospital from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. It was one of the first hospitals to introduce hydrotherapy in the late 19th century. Its superintendent from 1903 to 1937, William Allinson White, was a proponent of the use of psychoanalytic treatment in the early 20th century. So he was one of the first superintendents to actually introduce psychoanalysis into these large public mental hospitals. And then one of the American popularizers of lobotomy, William Freeman, also worked at St. Elizabeth in the 1930s. So again, it is really considered a preeminent mental hospital in the United States. It was also one of the few mental hospitals in the country prior to the 1950s to have a substantial racially heterogeneous patient population. And so the significant presence of Black patients at St. Elizabeth's really provides us an opportunity to examine how race and racism shaped psychiatric ideas and practices from the mid-19th to the late 20th century. Basically, if I was to boil this story down, ideas of racial difference were central to how psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's thought about insanity and mental health, and subsequently developed approaches to address them. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th, psychiatrists believed that the Black psyche was fundamentally different from the white psyche. And this contributed to a psychiatric consensus that a Black mental illness was different from a white mental illness. And in fact, mentally ill Black people were thought to be more depraved, more dangerous, and more quote unquote vicious, which was a term that was often used in the 19th century, than mentally ill white people. And this is really evident in not only the therapeutic regime of the hospital, but also the decisions made by the hospital's founders when they initially designed the hospital itself. So this image is an architectural plan of St. Elizabeth's from the mid-19th century. And here again, at this bottom of the page is the center building, again, a bird's eye view. And so you can see the tiered footprint here. And then if you go positioned on each side of the drawing halfway up are two smaller structures. One is a lodge for colored women, and the other is a lodge for colored men. And then at the top of the page, you see a little legend that it says has stables and then machinery. So this would have been where St. Elizabeth's had not only its stables, but its farm, as well as the kind of physical plants such as boiler rooms and whatnot. So basically, the hospital's initial superintendent, first superintendent, housed Black patients in buildings at some remove from the center building and the hospital's white patients. And essentially, they reproduced the racial topography of the plantation. If we kind of think about the center building as the big house and the lodge for colored men and women as quote unquote enslaved quarters. And these decisions were based on and reinforced the belief that the white psyche was the norm and that the white sufferer of mental illness should take precedence. But racial segregation of patients was not just a manifestation of racial segregation that existed in a larger society. It was actually justified by a therapeutic logic that held that exposure to the depravity and danger of mentally ill Blacks would impede the recovery of white patients. But this belief in the normative nature of the white psyche also produced a great deal of ambiguity when it came to psychiatrists' attempts to comprehend insanity among Black people. And these questions of what actually constituted Black madness and how it differed from the insanity experienced by whites characterized psychiatrists' interactions with Black sufferers of mental illness. And we see this in a couple of ways. So the admission of Black patients to St. Elizabeth's in the first place, despite the mid-19th century medical consensus that people of African descent as enslaved and primitive peoples possessed a natural immunity to slavery. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in Q&A. But we can also see it in this ambiguity in psychiatrists' attempts to explain the sudden epidemic of insanity among newly freed people in the post-emancipation period, especially in the 1880s and the 1890s, in which they attributed these rising rates of mental illness among freed people. They attributed it to freedom itself. So Black insanity really constituted an epistemological problem for psychiatrists. And it was this kind of ambiguity that underpinned therapeutic approaches that ranged from racial ambivalence to racist antipathy. And I just have a couple of examples of this. So one example is the housing of Black male patients. So a major therapeutic paradigm of the 19th and early 20th century was moral treatment, which dictated that mentally ill people should be removed from the sources of their stress and housed with people suffering from the same disease. Now, despite this, from the 1880s, despite this therapeutic logic, from the 1880s to the 1930s, African-American male patients were housed in the same building and later complex with insane convicts and the criminally insane, regardless of the Black male patient's diagnosis or their civil status. It didn't matter if they weren't diagnosed as being criminally insane or whether or not they had been criminals before or convicts before being admitted to St. Elizabeth. So this is image I have here is a photograph of Howard Hall, which was the building for the criminally insane that was built in the 1890s at St. Elizabeth. I believe this photograph is from 1897. And basically you see about 24 Black men in the foreground, some holding shovels, and they flank a white man. The Black men are patients. The white man might be a psychiatrist, could be an attendant. In the background is a 3-story building with a fence-enclosed veranda, and then in the foreground, we see piles of dirt, shovels, and wheelbarrows. And I think this image really reflects kind of the prevailing thought about Black insanity, particularly Black male insanity, because you have here them being housed in a space that is clearly more carceral than curative, and they're also basically performing menial labor for the hospital. And so the housing of Black men, along with the criminally insane and insane convicts for roughly half a century, was influenced by a larger cultural narrative that associated Blackness with criminality. And psychiatrists imagining the Black man is often associated it with the most debased forms of white insanity. So if there was a need to mix the races because of a lack of space, which basically was the motivation behind housing Black men with these criminally insane, from the superintendent's perspective, it was best to mix the most deviant, quote unquote, deviant patients, so as not to undermine white patients' presumed respectability. Another way in which therapy was shaped by racist assumptions about innate Black character or expectations. There were other ways, I should say, in which therapy was shaped by racist assumptions about innate Black character or expectation of what would constitute recovery. So, for instance, Black patients were much more likely to be subjected to mechanical restraints or seclusion, and hydrotherapy in the case of Black female patients. And again, this reinforced ideas about Blacks as being naturally intractable or disorderly. And rather than using psychotherapy to get to the root cause of Black patients' mental disorders, psychiatrists used it to address the surface manifestation of their psychoses and to also mediate their condition to the point that they could engage in labor, either inside the hospital or outside of it. And so this fifth image that I have is of the St. Elizabeth's Hospital laundry taken in 1918. We see 10 or 11 Black women standing at ironing boards On the right side of the photo is pictured piles of clothes. And basically, the hospital staff only used Black female patients to work in the laundry. So unlike the Enoch Pratt Hospital, these Black female patients would not have been doing embroidery. That would have been reserved for kind of white female patients. But this is the kind of therapeutic needle that psychiatrists had to thread, right? Framing racial segregation and a racial division of therapeutic labor, in which Black patients carried out more mental and hazardous chores, more menial and hazardous chores than white patients. But it was thought that this was conducive to the recovery of mental health for both Black patients and whites. So as St. Elizabeth's entered into the 20th century and began incorporating elements of mental hygiene into its therapeutic regime, ideas of racial difference and racist practice persisted. So mental hygiene was based on the preservation of, based on ideas of the preservation of mental health rather than the care or treatment of the institutionalized. And part of the mental health hygiene movement involved reducing the number of patients in mental hospitals. And so one of the ways they did this was to board out patients who may not have fully recovered, but were deemed to have been improved. And this was considered a quote unquote working parole. So one example that I just want to share is this, this Black patient who had been boarded out to a former employee of St. Elizabeth's at the former employee's request. And this patient was basically made to work as a domestic in this former employee's home. And here we have a letter written by the former employee who's basically complaining to the St. Elizabeth staff about the Black woman who had been discharged into her care. And I have this highlighted section you may not be able to read, but Irene Chapelier says, she has simply nearly worried me to death. I could not trust her for nothing and was such a terrible liar until she liked to have driven me mad, telling lies about the hospital, etc. She is right much disturbed, and really she is a very, very dangerous Negro to be at large. But the interesting thing here is that Irene wrote this letter to the hospital staff several weeks after the patient had just left the hospital. So she clearly did not really have her best interest at heart, right? This woman did not conform to her expectations of the kind of labor that she would perform, and she left. And then again, it took this former employee weeks to notify the hospital staff. So we really need to consider how this might have been a common practice throughout the South. I don't think there's been a lot of research on this, but we certainly see this as a dynamic with Black women who may have worked on chain gangs and in convict lease system in the South. When they were given kind of working paroles, they were actually often discharged or released into the homes of former employees or actually active employees of the prison. And so they were basically, they performed domestic labor. And so I think if we do more research, we might see a similar dynamic going on. So the extension of this kind of carcerality into the private home. So these racist therapeutic practices were shaped by the idea that, that Black and white psyches were fundamentally different. But even after we see the emergence of the post-World War II era consensus that race plays no fundamental role in an individual's psychical response to external stimuli, along with the desegregation of mental hospitals, these ideas about racial difference still persist. And an example of this is the integration of wards that began to occur in St. Elizabeth's in the 1950s. And again, this was done so largely because of the space limitations. They weren't using the space kind of effectively enough. And so they needed to begin to integrate some of these wards. But in the case of St. Elizabeth's, the first ward that they integrated was Howard Hall. And so they began with interracial group therapy sessions, and then ultimately the integration of the wards. And here that you have an image of an interior courtyard of a 3-story brick building, which is Howard Hall, and there's maybe about 3 dozen or so black and white men milling about or so. And so this really is kind of evocative of a prison courtyard. And so I don't think that it is in any way coincidental that the first wards to be integrated were basically the maximum security wards of Howard Hall. So while in some ways this marked a transformation in attitudes of St. Elizabeth's officials regarding the therapeutic value of racial segregation, it also represented a continuity of the logic articulated by psychiatrists a century earlier, that racial intermixing of the mentally ill should only be done among the most deviant and demented. And moreover, the history of the decisions made by St. Elizabeth's officials when it came to sacrificing the principles of the separation of the races in the face of limited space really reveals a larger belief about mental illness among African Americans, a belief that has always associated Blackness with criminality and depravity. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Summers. That's brilliant and illuminating. If anybody has any questions, comments that they would like to make, we're going to save them for the Q&A when we'll discuss all the presentations together. But now we're going to, let's hear from our next panelists, the Greene Clinic Fountain House, Dr. Laura Dent, Dr. Matthew Oyer, and Dr. Chris Landry. Welcome.
Thank you, Eddie and Mathilde, for having us. We're very excited to be here. And thank you, Dr. Summers, for your presentation. That was wonderful, disturbing, but excellent. We're going to kind of move rather quickly because there's 3 of us. So just to say that I know I'm moving rather quickly in the things that I'll be speaking about, and if there's questions, please don't hesitate to bring them up in the discussion. So yeah, as Eddie mentioned, we're going to shift gears somewhat and try to think about how the principles of institutional psychotherapy can be kind of brought into, honored by opening them up into a new context, the context of our times and our location. Warren, you want to go to the next slide? So the 3 of us will be speaking about a treatment program that we're working on and have developed for the treatment of psychosis now. And we're going to talk about a kind of series of concepts that we have inherited from institutional psychotherapy in Tosquelles, and then talk briefly about the program at the end. So this section is on circulation and translation, which we take to be central concepts for our program, and certainly are adapted from the work of Tosquelles and Horry and others, as well as some of the work in sector psychiatry, which we'll talk about briefly as well in France. The anthropologist Kim Hopper coined the term the institutional circuit to describe the movement of homeless individuals through a series of non-traditional institutions, shelters, city hospitals, respite centers, nursing and rehabilitation facilities, detox and substance abuse programs, jails, and prisons. And that these various institutions have been, in the wake of deinstitutionalization, have been kind of pressed into service and acquired an accretion of various functions that the hospital once served. So I think the idea of the institutional circuit is that, like, there's a kind of movement between all of these sites that have no communication with each other. And so there's a kind of breakdown of continuity of care is what they've come to call the attempt to kind of patch this problem. And the governmental proposals to manage the crisis of the institutional circuit, which aim to address this fragmentation, but they also simultaneously tend to exacerbate its desubjectivizing mechanisms. And I think we could just look to New York City, Mayor Eric Adams' 11-point plan on mental health to understand a little bit about this. So the mechanism of action for most models of continuity of care, we would argue anyway, is the technological and bureaucratic expansion of surveillance techniques, assessment and measurement, databases, centralized medical records, mandated reporting, etc. And surveillance methods like these represent a unidirectional observation, tracking, and control of bodies, getting at what theorists Adler, Bolton, and Kant in their book Health Communism describe as extractive abandonment, or the way that capital reinscribes the surplus population that had initially escaped its capture through the counting of bodies, in the measuring of bodies, this is a quotation, in the creation and destruction of bodies, in every locus where capitalism touches illness, disease, disability, and death. Now, the argument that we want to make today is that while the institutional circuit is unquestionably pernicious, the problem is not that of decentralization and distribution of treatment in social sites. And you can think back to Camille's talk about Tosquelles' commitment to decentralization, both in political work and in therapeutic work. But rather it's this unidirectional control and extractive abandonment and the homogenization of continuity of care that are the problem. So we've been influenced by the revolutionary practices of institutional psychotherapy and sector psychiatry in France. And our wager is that it's possible to move from the closed and homogenizing circuit to one of circulation and translation. As many of you know, the concept of circulation, of freedom of movement, the creation of spaces of saying and of spontaneous encounter, along with an emphasis on heterogeneity, difference, the attunement to and transformational potential of distinct atmospheres, all of these were central to the project of institutional psychotherapy. Well, I don't have time today to outline the history of sector psychiatry in France. It was in some ways similar to the movement of deinstitutionalization and its promises of community mental health in the United States. And it was a movement that was supported by many of the founding figures of institutional psychotherapy. While the institutional circuit of closed repetition and desubjectified movement tends to reify something of the frozenness of signs that is often determinative of psychotic experience, the psychoanalyst Guy Dana sought to create in Paris a multi-site treatment apparatus comprising of 7 sites, which patients would move between. Here's a quote from Guy. Each site and the myriad providers sought to sustain the singular nature of the site, the distinction of roles within that site, and the singularity of each individual style, but to simultaneously support the work of translation that each patient must make in this process of circulation. So Guy says, in each institutional place, we create our own language. We perform our healing there, and it is not perceived in the same way, depending on the place where it was constructed. Ultimately, it is a true translation that each patient confronts, a translation that he formulates or formulates himself. He must confront it or learn about it, because the symptoms are not felt in the same way from one place to another. All right, I'm going to hand off to Chris.
Right. Thanks, Matthew. So the practitioners of institutional psychotherapy understood their work as needing to cure the institution of the hospital before the work of treating patients could be done. You might say that our notion of circulation is trying to articulate a first step towards curing the phenomenon of the institutional circuit. But the question remains, what does daily life actually look like for patients in this world? What should we ask of them? One answer that we take from Tosquelles is ergotherapy. That's a Greek term meaning therapeutic work. For Tosquelles at Saint-Alban Hospital, that included both reproductive and productive labor. So the cooking, cleaning, and laundry in which everyone in the hospital participated, as well as the governance of the hospital, the publishing of a newspaper and the making of art, which includes many of the items exhibited at AFAM. But we have to think some more about what the value of this work is, like why undertake this labor. And for Tosquelles, it's not about fashioning objects or learning useful skills. As he wrote, the object created in ergotherapy did not have a therapeutic value in and of itself, but was invested with affective, economic, and social values. That is to say, its value is in the process of the work in the context of relationships within the community, a process that he described the goal as consciousness raising or discovery of the other. Next slide, please, Lauren. So I think it's helpful to get an illustration. And one excellent example of this kind of process, although not theorized as an institutional psychotherapy site, is the clubhouse movement, which began at the time of Tosquelles and endures to the present. So Fountain House, the place where I work, is the original clubhouse. There are now some 340 around the world. But it's a therapeutic community that was founded in 1948 in New York by ex-patients from Rockland State Hospital, many of whom had been there for decades, to support one another in their recovery outside of the totalizing institution. The clubhouse is distinct from formal treatment. It's not a place that people go for one-on-one psychotherapy or to be prescribed medications. It's rather a club with members. The members have serious mental illness. Their membership is free and lifelong, and voluntariness over how they participate and when they go is central to its ethic. The clubhouse is organized around what we call the work-ordered day, where members and paid staff work side by side, doing tasks that support the community as a whole. The idea is that members make valued contributions to the community, and in fact, the community couldn't function without their active participation. Next slide, please. So the clubhouse itself is divided up into different functional units, each of which does some set of work that supports the whole. One unit is the culinary unit, which not only serves meals, but also has to think about and be responsive to the needs of the community. It has to plan menus, order ingredients, prepare and serve meals, but also survey the community about what they actually want. A communications unit, which is pictured in the photo on the right, does the useful tasks of delivering internal mail and answering the phones, but it also writes and publishes a weekly newspaper and a quarterly lit mag. The home and garden unit, for instance, does the sort of beautification and maintenance of the house. They do horticulture, hang up art, and do routine repairs. So we have a newspaper, an art studio, an art gallery that's open to the public. And there's ample evidence that the disability that occurs in serious mental illness is not first and foremost from the most visible symptoms, the hallucinations and delusions, but rather from the loss of motivation, the loss of desire to do and to connect. Clubhouses answer this through addressing the need to be needed, finding healing through meaningful participation in the commons. And so, inspired by Frantz Fanon's contributions to the patient-run newspaper at his hospital in Algeria, I wrote about my appreciation for clubhouse work for the Fountain House Times, our paper. I wrote, "In illness, we may feel cut off from past and future with only an open, meaningless now. We may not be able to arrange our thoughts so that someone else can understand and respond to them. But in writing, we have to put down on the page something we saw, or what we're thinking, or some future plan. And this means that we must have in mind a reader and arrange our ideas for another person to join with us. And not only in writing, the same thing is happening in every unit of the clubhouse. This is Tosquelles' idea of the discovery of the other through therapeutic work." Next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude my remarks by focusing on one, I think, beautiful instance of this process that's happening at Fountain House now. Actually, its first meeting will occur as soon as we finish this panel. It's a collective art workshop that was organized by a member, Connor Gannon, with whom I work closely. He learned about the AFAM exhibit from me, got very interested in it. He read Camille's book and proposed this project responding to it. He asked me to help lead it. So we, together with a group of Fountain House members and possibly staff, I'll find out in an hour or so, will visit the AFAM exhibit, read texts and watch film related to institutional psychotherapy, reflect on the purpose of creativity and its relationship to recovery, and then create art together. Its culmination will be a public show at Fountain House's gallery which is in Hell's Kitchen. It opens August 6th, and the gallery's open to the public, so everyone is welcome to attend. I think it's a beautiful illustration of productive circulation, the transforming of other sites in the city into sites of relationship, work, and healing. And so in our Constellation program, we're of course referring our patients to become Fountain House members, but we're also looking for other ways to develop this kind of work as therapy, work in community through the projects in our small collective. So now I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Chris. Freud famously suggested that psychoanalytic therapy was ill-suited for psychotic subjects, as they were incapable of developing transference to the clinician. The dominance of narcissistic investment meant that the libido of the psychotic was only self-referential, unable to encounter the other. Psychoanalysts from both the European and American traditions contested Freud's skepticism, and an array of theories developed to account for not the absence of transference in psychosis, but rather its specificity. Through his work at St. Alban, Tosquelles coined the term multi-referential investments, or burst transference, to describe how schizophrenic subjects relate to a multitude of people and objects in their environment, requiring an institution that can gather and hold those investments. Jean-Henri extended this idea as dissociated transference and drew on the work of Freud's contemporary Weiler. In his 1934 textbook of psychiatry, Weiler described among the basic symptoms of schizophrenia a disturbance in the associative process, a fundamental splitting or dissociation. For Henri, dissociative transference requires a collective undertaking. He writes, and I'm quoting, "The first step consists of finding the means for the schizophrenic to be somewhere, even slightly so, even if it is at certain moments only. It is a question of reweaving a form of personal space that can be more or less comfortably inhabited. It is only at this moment that we can address the patient in his or her existential dimension, in his or her historical dimension. To create a space is a difficult task that necessitates a reconsideration of the whole apparatus, a task that is always collective, whether it's a hospital, a district hospital, or at home," end quote. To use space as a kind of intervention, as Matthew described, and circulation between space, these become essential to the gathering up of an otherwise dispersed psychical material. The movement between spaces and the testimonies that arise in singular encounters with different transference objects opens up the possibility of analytic intervention and acts as a kind of symbolic supplement to the signifying ruptures of psychosis. To work with a dissociated transference, in which the unconscious is, as Lacan said of psychosis, out in the open, Henri, following Tosquelles, spoke of spontaneous meetings of the constellation of caregivers of a given patient. These meetings would emerge to allow for the caregivers who have contact with the patient to testify to their encounters, including the differing or shared countertransference or perspectives on the patient. Henri described it this way in 2007. "With the liberty of speech, the moment of constellation comes into effect. Over 1 or 2 hours, let us say, we speak about the history of the patient, but we speak about other things as well, of affective relations, hatred, sympathy, and so on. And the following day or several days later, there is a change. For the people concerned, there is something of themselves that they do not know, which is put into question. It is at the level of their unconscious desire," end quote. So in such meetings of transferential constellation, something of the caregiver's own desire is put to the test in their encounter with the patient, so that something in turn becomes possible to translate, circulate, with new links to be formed to create and undo certain narratives of the patient that have kept him or her alienated and sick. So if anyone has more questions about the program, please, we can discuss in the Q&A. But very briefly, the Constellation program at the Greene Clinic is very new, very nascent. We have a very small number of people that we're working with. We've designed an institution that is spread among several locations and roles. And these roles include the psychotherapist, the psychiatrist, Chris Landry, what we call the liaison, who is one who accompanies the patient and also critically questions the clinical team, and meetings with the patient's network, however the patient defines their network, oftentimes family, but also friends, coworkers, other providers, and so forth. And we hold regular constellation meetings as a team. Importantly, the patient's encounter with these different caregivers are not within the same location. So they encounter different spaces with the aim of elaborating unique transferences to places and people. Our hope is to introduce this function of circulation of speech held securely by the regular constellation meetings. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It's great to hear about this fascinating and inspiring work. And I'm sure a lot of our participants in the Zoom right now are probably having a lot of questions and conceptually that we'll want to draw out in the Q&A in relation to the other panels. So without further ado, we're going to get to our final panelist, Dr. Liat Ben-Moshe. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
sounds good.
Great. So I'm gonna talk today. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this amazing symposium and wonderful exhibit. And what looks like now, Chris, your patients might do a side exhibit to the exhibit. So 2 reasons to come to New York, I suppose. So thank you, so much for the invitation. My presentation has a lot of words on it for kind of access purposes, but for people for whom words is too much, feel free to just listen. And I'm going to be talking about basically connecting this idea of institutional psychotherapy to what happened in the US. So in some ways to connect what Dr. Summers was talking to the presentation we just heard from Fountain House and the Greene Clinic, to connect the then and the now in some ways. So on the slide, it says the American experiment in dissolving the asylum, what happened and what now. And there's 2 images. One is from expose from 1946 called Bedlam. And the other one is a picture. I just Googled the word deinstitutionalization, and a lot of these images came up, and I just randomly chose one, which is a supposedly a homeless person that's holding a sign that says seeking human kindness. There's actually 3 images with the same sign, but different people holding it. So it's really interesting when you just Google deinstitutionalization. And the spoiler alert is that the top image did not actually lead to the bottom image. And I'm going to kind of end the presentation with why. So for people who are kind of less aware, there was a lot of discussion throughout the panels today about madness. What I try to do in my book, which is called Decarcerating Disability, is to provide a genealogy of various movements that resist carcerality, both in the kind of prison sense and the psychiatric and institutionalization sense. And what connects a lot of it together is what I call racial criminal pathologization, which is how criminalization and pathologization, and by that I mean the way people are medicalized and psychiatrized, both of these things, criminalization and pathologization, are pathways that lead to policing and surveillance and confinement. And it's really important to understand them as connected and also as gendered and racialized, as of course Martin showed us at the beginning. And one of the things that I try to talk about a lot in the book is how abolition and reform are connected to each other. And I think that's one of the kind of pendulums that was discussed in the previous panel as well. I wanted to say that it's really important to understand that there's actually been 2 deinstitutionalizations in the US, and they were connected but also distinct. One was institutionalization in mental health, what we talked about all day in terms of psychiatrization and de-psychiatrization. And the second is the deinstitutionalization of people with intellectual or developmental disability. That occurred about 15 years later in the US, although it kind of varied by state. The reason why I think it's really important to add IDD here, or intellectual and developmental disability, is because I just want to make sure I'm not too fast for the interpreters. Okay, just stop me if I am. Okay, thank you. Is because there's a lot of connections between those 2 movements, but also in some respects, deinstitutionalization in IDD took a cue from deinstitutionalization in psychiatry in terms of what not to do, and was also ideologically actually really radical, and called for the closure of all institutions for people with all disabilities. And in psychiatry, it was more varied. So one of the things that I want to kind of talk about today is to dispel some myths about deinstitutionalization and anti-psychiatry in the US. So when I say deinstitutionalization, what I mean is the transition of people with psychiatric or intellectual or other disabilities from state institutions and hospitals into community living, right? Like living in the community, not moving to a different institutions. That is not true deinstitutionalization. But I also mean the closure of these institutions themselves. And then, of course, the question is, okay, what do we do with the institutions? We can talk about that later. The third thing, which most historians and policy people and people who talk about deinstitutionalization don't mention, is the deinstitutionalization, to me, is also a process. So deinstitutionalization is a movement, it's a logic, it's a framework, it's actually many movements that came together, and they came together to counteract the institutional model, to counteract segregation. And we don't often think about deinstitutionalization as a desegregation movement, but I want to propose that we should. It's connected, of course, in time frame to the civil rights movement. Deinstitutionalization in psychiatric hospital, occurred starting the end of the 50s and then the 60s. In intellectual and developmental disability, like I said, about 15 years later. So it's connected in time frame and also a little bit following of racial desegregation. The tactics were also very similar, and a lot of the times they also intersected, and I show that throughout the book. But the point is that we don't often talk about it as a framework. We don't often talk about it as a logic. We don't talk about it as a desegregation movement. There's a lot of factors that led to deinstitutionalization in the kind of American case in the US, and I'm only going to mention them very briefly, and then counter them in some ways, which I do much more elaborately in the book. But of course, federal programs and policy led to the fact that we could have deinstitutionalization, waivers, right? Things like Medicare and Medicaid that didn't even exist until 1965 in the US. Definitely really decreased the reliance on long institutionalization, but also led to this institutional bias that we still have today, in which people with disabilities who get benefits, the benefits go to the institution and not to them. So we still have that. That's a legacy of those programs. Secondly, and this was discussed in earlier panels as well, the power of psychotherapeutics, which is basically the story of Thorazine in the US. I highly recommend Judith Swayze's work, her book about Thorazine. Thorazine started in the US as a cost-effective measure of institutionalization, not deinstitutionalization. And I think that that's really important to say, because when we look at the role of the pharmaceuticals played, and we bring in the field of intellectual and developmental disability, psychopharmaceuticals were used in a lot, if not all, IDD institutions. But they were never discussed, and they're still not discussed in kind of the origin story of how deinstitutionalization happened in the field of intellectual disabilities. So it's not just the effects that these had, it's really the rhetorical power that Thorazine had. So Thorazine, of course, is a drug that kind of sedates people, and the point was to make them more amenable to things like group therapy, to make them more amenable to live in an institution. They were never kind of meant even as a drug that would liberate people. That's not how even the company looked at it that made Thorazine. But it really fit within scientific discourse, as Foucault reminds us. Foucault is Foucault. It really fit within a scientific discourse of biopsychiatry that tried to establish itself as the discourse of psychiatry in the same time frame as deinstitutionalization, that saw mental illness not as madness, but as an illness. So it fit more in the discourse than the actual consequences. The other thing that happened in the US that is very US-centric is the use of law, because the US is a litigation-based society. It's very different than a lot of European societies in that way, founded on a constitution, very rights-based. And there's been a lot of legal action, what is called institutional reform litigation, particularly in the 60s and 70s, which is kind of the era of disability rights. And a lot of really important cases were litigated as, kind of class action lawsuits. So these also acted as kind of exposés, and they had a cumulative effect. They brought to the public the really horrid conditions within institutions. But ultimately what that did is that led to reform. That did not lead to abolition. That did not lead people to critique the rationale of confinement, but only critique the conditions of confinement. In addition, and I think there's no at all negation of the fact that it was austerity and neoliberalism that ended bringing deinstitutionalization as we know it in the US. So what I mean by that is cuts to social services while increasing spending on correction and punishment. And that is where the budgets still are, and the priorities and ideologically. So if institutional psychotherapy was about not fixing the person, but fixing the environment, I think it has a lot of connections with also a lot of the things we talk about in disability rights and disability justice and deinstitutionalization as it came to be in the US as well. But in the US case, again, the pendulum between reform and abolition is really interesting. And what I learned from it by doing, a lot of research, both in IDD and psychiatry, is that incremental changes and reform may chip at the margin, but they did not break the center. So you might ask, okay, so all of these led to some kind of deinstitutionalization, but what led to deinstitutionalization as abolition? And I think that what led to it were the movements, meaning they might not have been the one that closed the institution. Again, neoliberalism, Thorazine, the Medicaid, Medicare, of course. But deinstitutionalization as abolition, as anti-segregation, as you will not incarcerate us under any circumstance, including, like I said, in the self-advocacy movement, the movement of people with intellectual disabilities, what we used to call mental retardation. very early on called for closing down all residential institutions for people with intellectual disabilities that they saw as incarceration. And we often don't talk about that. And this is because we don't talk about intellectual disability as part of deinstitutionalization, but also we don't talk about the kind of radical arm of deinstitutionalization and the radical effects of that arm. We tend in the literature especially to have kind of a caricature of anti-psychiatry. And it's really important to talk about anti-psychiatry and the resistance within consumer, survivor, ex-patient, med movements, the resistance to psychiatry, the resistance to the institution, the resistance that try to drive, and we can talk about successfully or not, to a different way of looking at difference. In the US, it definitely was not just driven by psychiatrists, it was driven by, a lot of movements. And the reason why, this is really important is because people resisted psychiatry from a lot of different directions, and we often don't really talk about that. There was a lot of kind of radical movements in the 60s, in the 70s, for example, SNCC, SNCC, Student for Democratic Society, Black Panthers, that had, you can see in their newsletters and some of their campaign, had a very strong anti-psychiatry stance. And we don't talk about it as an anti-psychiatry because we like to kind of flatten it into the caricature with the image that I showed at the beginning of my presentation. The caricature kind of claims deinstitutionalization, failed, led to people in the streets. The other problem with this caricature narrative of anti-psychiatry and deinstitutionalization is that it really erases the variation within the movements and leads us from really centering abolition in the most kind of complex cases, which is what happened in a lot of deinstitutionalization, especially in the field of intellectual disabilities. What they pushed to close down first were institutions for the people with the most complex needs, which I think is a very feminist practice. It's very connected to what today we might call disability justice principles. And it's the ability and the need to push the margin to the center, just to start from the most complex. And instead of looking at kind of those examples, we again create this caricature of anti-psychiatry and deinstitutionalization. Also, instead of centering kind of abolition in the movement as opposed to reform, I want to say that this kind of respectability politics is also a feature of disability rights itself. So this is not something I'm blaming on people that are here in the panel, but it's very systemic actually to how the US does change, right? That it is reform-based, it's rights-based, it's not necessarily abolitionary. And particularly in the case of disability rights, this is what I call Disability Inc., INC. And what I mean by that is incarcerated and incorporated. So one of the questions, that I ask, again, with and through social movements for disability and madness, is what is the cost of inclusion? What is the cost, basically socially and culturally, and sometimes also financially, of including disability into the mainstream? The kind of thing that we talk about with institutional psychotherapy as well. What happens when we so-called win? And the reason why I'm calling it disability incarcerated and incorporated is because incorporation means incorporating difference, but into something already ready-made, right? Like into the status quo. It's basically assimilation. And it's an assimilation into very particular norms. And ideas, and one would say also assimilation into structures like war and colonialism and poverty. And it's also incorporation because what have happened within deinstitutionalization in the US is the disbursement of confinement into a lot of for-private or kind of making money off the reinstitutionalization of people with disabilities in a variety of spaces like nursing home, spaces like group homes. There's a lot of homes in the titles, but none of them are real homes. And lastly, and this is my last point, this is kind of the last problem with the caricature narrative of anti-psychiatry and deinstitutionalization, is that it leads us to a caricature of what's happening now. We have no way to analyze what's happening now because of the way we think of the past and the way that we think about these movements. So I think we can all share, well, maybe, I'll just put it out there. You know, the 80s are back, not just in clothes and fashion and music, but also, you know, in terms of what's happening now, in terms of the policies that the previous speakers were just mentioning of what's going on right now in New York. And I think the 80s are back, maybe the 1980s, or maybe it's the 1880s, you know, to go back to Dr. Summers' talk earlier. We are seeing the revitalization of literally calling for asylums, you know, like Dorothea Dix, right? Like calling for public, you know, bonds for asylum. This is what Prop 1 in California that just passed. That's exactly what it did. And so I want to say, you know, kind of two things to end this. So first, here's a graph, the only graph I think of today and probably tomorrow as well. I'm sorry. I was raised as a social scientist. I'm in recovery. But, you know, the graph shows how the prison and jail population in the US started to rise starting in the 70s, kind of 70s, 80s. The mental hospital population started to drop, and we can see that starting in the 60s. And often people say deinstitutionalization led to the rise of incarceration in prisons and jails. But in terms of timing, that's not, you know, quite right, as you can see in this graph. But more importantly, why are we blaming deinstitutionalization for what is in essence political and political, economic, and cultural phenomena? People did not become homeless, going back to the image that I said today. People did not become homeless because they needed to be in institutions. Nobody needed to be in institutions. Nobody ever needs to be in an institution. And homelessness is not a structural issue that comes from institutionalization. It comes from not having affordable and accessible housing. What did happen at the same time, and this is absolutely true, and I said that at the beginning, is that the budgets for corrections, for policing, and for punishments rose at the same time that they were decimated for housing and for disability. And so bottom line is, deinstitutionalization in the US didn't just fail because people were dreamers and some kind of caricature about psychiatrists, but it failed purposefully. It was never implemented. There's coordinated smear campaign against it from day one, including funded campaigns, including now. There are funded campaigns against deinstitutionalization, which leads us to not think about it as the biggest decarceration movement in US history. I want to end with this slide, which is what is happening now. And I hope to connect this conversation with specifically what's happening in New York. I want, you know, it'd be really great to hear from the people in the Greene Clinic and in Fountain House. Carceral saneism is what I'm calling what's happening now. And saneism, for people who don't know, is the oppression of people faced due to kind of the imperative to be sane, to be rational, to be not mad or crazy. And carceral saneism is the praxis or belief that people with disabilities need any kind of special or extra protection in ways that often expand or legitimate their marginalization and incarceration. So particularly what's happening right now is a call to bring back the asylum, particularly in New York and in California. And this is happening now with Mayor Adams' plan for, and not just planned, but it's an infrastructure that's being built, billions of dollars. That's in New York, for example, is AOT's, assistive outpatient treatment, which is basically involuntary commitment. And I want to go back just to Martin Summers' presentation to say, again, I don't know if it's the 1980s or the 1880s. I mean, the racism in AOT is like really staggering. And in terms of the image that we have of the quote unquote kind of homeless, mentally ill as well, I think we can really see the connections between what does it mean to call for reestablishing asylums? Who do we think should be in this new kind of treatment slash carceral space? And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben-Moshe. This is excellent, and I think puts us in a great position to kind of reflect on this panel. During the last one, we had a question that fits nicely as a conclusion to where we've ended up here, where Jennifer Stutz had asked about this shift from historically from the civil commitment in the US to criminal. And I think this nicely attests to the way in which these ideologies work in tandem. One thing I noticed while listening to the three groups of panelists speaking was like a different sort of emphasis on the totality of the bigger picture of what mental institutions so designated, how they fit into a broader picture. And I think while we kind of open up for questions and open the Q&A and see what comes in from our audience, off the top of my head, the first thing that occurs to me is that hearing about, Dr. Summers talked about how within an institution, there is then the racist presuppositions, then question of how it's getting there is very much a inside look at then what Dr. Ben-Moshe is talking about in a larger picture. There's no contradiction there. I think they work nicely together. I'd be interested to hear from the Greene Clinic and Fountain House, since you're working with those networks in the Constellations program, or I know you said it's early in the program, but putting together different parts of a social totality. So you have whoever's in the personal network, different providers, and what kind of image of the, if you, for lack of a better term, social totality, or are you seeing perhaps on the ground? I know we talked about maybe hearing about what's going on in New York, and I think what Dr. Ben-Moshe has noted about New York and California is something I've been seeing in the news a lot. So I'd be curious to hear from the standpoint of practice what you're seeing and thinking. And also, if anybody else would like to raise questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A, and I will sort of help get them to the panelists.
Who wants to take this one? I mean, something just came to my mind, which I think is important to clarify. I don't think this quite answers your question, but our program is not currently nor ever will be on the scale that would counter what we kind of highlighted as the institutional circuit and this recurring problem, structural problem here in New York City and elsewhere. We've had to be incredibly inventive, in how to work, kind of outside such institutions that we even, we have referrals that come from colleagues on inpatient units. Some people in our program may at times require or choose to engage in those institutions. Something that we actually encourage our clients to do is what some people in the peer movement call a MAD map, which is essentially an advanced directive. So in moments where they're feeling more grounded, they will work on establishing a plan for, you know, difficult periods, stressful periods, periods where they become, you know, agitated or things start to feel unwell for them, so that they can in advance kind of tell the people close to them what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, where they want to go, what medications they do or don't want, so that they can actively participate in that. All this is to say is that I think, you know, there's this kind of thorny problem of what we've sort of developed being necessarily and unfortunately so kind of split off from the kind of more structural problems here in the city and elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, maybe Chris and Matthew have other thoughts.
Yeah, you know, we hear about the Trieste model, say, in Italy, right? And that began in the state asylums, sort of at the tail end of the fascist period of government in Italy. And the people who led that movement simply worked within the government structure of that institution, but disregarded its mandates altogether. That was at a time and place when the degree of surveillance and regulation, not just of, I mean, the surveillance and regulation of patients was often extreme, but for, you know, physicians running a hospital, they could kind of have carte blanche, at least until, you know, some annual review. And so they were able to kind of disregard the rules. I think, you know, charts for years at a time would be falsified for patients for whom, you know, they thought that there could be something better than what the law and the system of the hospital mandated. Now that's actually not possible, right? You know, there isn't that kind of freedom for individual judgment. And in some cases that's good because that, you know, that constrains certain kinds of abuses. But again, within this very reformist, not abolitionist framework. And so, yeah, I think we struggle with the question of what relationship to have to the institutions as they exist. Is there something that can be done there? But abandoning them also means abandoning the people that our society abandons to the institutions.
Thank you for this comment. Oh, Matthew, would you? Thanks.
Yeah, just add, you know, we did this event that Chris helped organize a year or so ago with a mutual aid group called Woodbine, where we screened a film, a documentary about the board, the Right to Madness, I believe. It has a very poignant ending, right? Where I guess, like, even before I get there, like the background of this, I think, is you know, certain conflicts that existed even at the time between institutional psychotherapy and anti-psychiatry, where you know, anti-psychiatry, there's lots of similarities and lots of differences, but the idea of, like, I think anti-psychiatry having a more abolitionist view in some ways than institutional psychotherapy, in that the institution is always going to be bad, versus, like, institutional psychotherapy, like, we have to we need institutions, not necessarily psychiatric institutions, but institutions in society. And the idea of creating an institution that has, like, this constant kind of reflexive loop of, like, everybody's involved in creating law that then each will be subject to. And the film ends in this poignant moment where a group of patients at the board are speaking about, well, something here works quite well. Like, you know, there's something utopic about the board, but then how do you leave, right? Society is not utopic in the same way. And I think this is a kind of very, you know, difficult question. And I think it is, there is some hope that that not being in hospitals, that like having a program, an institution that is distributed throughout the city, and that potentially is connected to other similar institutions that are not, again, decentralized. There's no like the state is determining these things, but rather a kind of network of loosely affiliated independent institutions that are sharing a certain ethic of like this constant reflexivity and constant participation could potentially change the city, right? Instead of it being segregated, if you distribute it within the city, that something more might be possible. So, and I mean, I think the Adams plan for us had a kind of catalyzing effect. Like, this is a crisis, right? This is a crisis right now that we're seeing. I mean, I guess there already was a crisis, but now there's a new crisis. And that I think we're trying to respond to that. That catalyzes us to start the program, I think, and trying to respond in a way much like a psychotic crisis, right? That a psychotic crisis is not just something falling. It's, you know, I hate this word, like and now I'm forgetting the word.
Decompensation.
Decompensation, right? That it's not just some disintegration of something, right? But a crisis is a moment to act, right? And the psychotic crisis, the kind of cultural crisis that we're in, it might be this might be a moment, right? This might be a moment for something new to open up. Thin hope, but a hope.
I like the way you've put this, just for the reason also that whereas in the case of like Dr. Summers mentioned, where like the asylum decides to even desegregate to a certain extent based on not goodwill, but like lack of space or something like this, and then this very pragmatic aspect, even if insidious, that Dr. Ben-Moshe mentioned about the call for asylums that we're hearing over and over again and again with Adams' plans, that it's kind of with this distributed vision dodges maybe it is not subject to this sort of thing, but it allows also for the seizing of crises in this nice way. We have a few questions coming up now in the chat. One is, do you think the advent of new medication is the product of not patient care, but of the economy, not in the sense of pharma companies selling medication, but to make the patient participate in the economy quicker to conform our work week? So I'm just going to toss that out there for whoever would like to answer it. I think it's a good question. I second the question even. But if any of our panelists would like to jump in, feel free.
I just want to second, I don't remember what part of the presentation, maybe it was your part, Matthew, I don't remember, but you mentioned health communism. This is the book you should read in answer to that question, because, you know, it talks exactly like you said, not about this kind of conspirational psychopharmacology taking over the world, which, again, psychopharmacology is a lot of things, but a really much more analytical understanding of, you know, extractive abandonment, basically. That abandonment is not just kind of like a free-for-all. It targets particular population and how it works within health and healthcare. So yeah, that would be kind of my shout out. And I also wanted to say, and I think this is related to what Chris was saying earlier in response to your question, Edward. A similar thing happened in prisons in the US. A similar thing, meaning everything became bureaucratized in a way that did not allow for the kind of, you know, in the prison sense, it did not allow for the kind of sheriff totalitarianism that existed before, right? Like, we just do what we want, And of course, in some states in the US, that's exactly what's still happening in prisons, Arizona, Texas. But in other states, it's very, very, very monitored and supervised in a way that, like when I go teach in Cook County here in the jail, we have now a no paper policy. By that, they mean literally there's no papers. You cannot bring a paper. I can bring a book. I teach a class. No book, no paper, no nothing, and then when it becomes a policy and you can't argue with it, because why, you say, who cares? It's a policy. Now we have a policy, and there you go. So you can't kind of do the kind of things that you're talking about. So that has been part of what kind of corrections and carcerality has brought to itself, but also to the kind of psychiatric system and the kind of monitoring. And I want to address the other question that was in, but I'll let Martin, others chime in.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to new medication, but I just want to go back to and endorse what Dr. Ben-Moshe said about Thorazine, and how initially the promise of Thorazine was really more about patient management, and obviously, they also thought that it was it was an improvement on other drugs in the sense that it had the sedative effect, but it didn't cloud patients' consciousness, and so it would make them more amenable to group therapy or psychotherapy, as Dr. Ben-Moshe would say. But in a place like St. Elizabeth's that had 8,000 patients, there was only going to be a small percentage of these patients who were actually going to benefit, or going to benefit from psychotherapy or group therapy to begin with. And so they really thought of it as, I guess, a more humane form of restraint than mechanical restraint, right? It's just a form of chemical restraint, really. And in fact, many of these right to treatment cases, right? The one that originated in St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. in 1966, Rouse v. Cameron, and others, they were basically, charging that they had been institutionalized, but they weren't giving treatment. They were just basically being medicated, and that was it. And even the clinical director of St. Elizabeth's Community Mental Health Center in, I think, the early 1970s, as they began, releasing more and more patients from St. Elizabeth's, was incredibly critical of the process, because he essentially said that we were we're just letting people out with these prescriptions for Thorazine or Reserpin, and there's no follow-up, there's no continuity of care. We're really not attempting to address the underlying problem here. So I don't think that I should say maybe for some they thought that this might be this new class of drugs might allow them to be become integrated into the economy better, but for most, it was, again, just a more efficient way of managing them.
I mean, this is very interesting because it reminds me of certain lines of like political thought, even, that distinguish between changing everything such that nothing changes, and then like what would constitute a true change, which is often then effectively conceived as what politics is. For Tosquelles, treatment was at a certain level. He spoke about the two legs of his thought in Marx and Freud, but in some sense there was this like constant homology between the two that raises the question to me that if these are questions that come down, that treatment itself comes down to political questions, to what extent might we, like, are we dealing with the same problem at the level of institution? Like, is society functioning similar in that way? That's an incredibly broad question with a long history that I wanted to just throw out there in the broadest sense to tap into the larger body of Tosquelles' thought for the sake of this panel. But I think I'll bridge it also with a specific part of society that's been mentioned in the Q&A section here. Max Min asks, is there a space for youth models similar to those mentioned, i.e. contemporary deinstitutionalization movement targeted at youth-oriented institutions, troubled teen industry, etc.? Do clubhouses have youth members? Also, we get a +1, a shout out for Woodbine. Sir, I like this question because it kind of made me aware of something I hadn't thought of. That is, in a way, we've talked about how there's this kind of reactionary tendency in the institutionalization movements, but that when we hear so much about youth mental health crises today, there's actually, off the top of my head, maybe I haven't heard personally of an analog for like deinstitutionalization in that regard, in the sense that we've described deinstitutionalization as a desegregationist reasoning. So I'm wondering then, with regards to the question of institution, if anybody knows of or has any thoughts on this youth issue, since so much of youth institutions or lack thereof is something that is in a murky territory between being a child and a proper legal entity as an adult in the society of litigation. I like this term earlier that we live in. So if anybody has any thoughts on this youth model deinstitutionalization question, I think this would be something very cool to hear about.
This is not an area about which I know a lot. And I want to mention an institution in New York called the Door. It's one that I've had limited interaction with, pretty favorable of what I've seen, but I don't think I know enough to like give it an unreserved endorsement. But it does seem to have a bit of a utopian aspiration as a place for youth. I forget what the lowest age you can go is. It's like maybe 13 or 14 up to 12. 12. Okay, 12 up to 24, I think. And it's a place where youth can go. They have a policy of like not answering questions about who's there when people call, unless someone wants their parent, guardian, or what have you to know. There's a huge amount of programming that can get youth involved in all sorts of things that they might be interested in. There's a healthcare center, mental health, and like a lot of support. And the space, one thing I didn't talk about at Fountain House is just that like the space is welcoming, inviting, and beautiful. The units that are responsible for that care really do their job, and the institution as a whole invests in making it not feel institutional in the kind of pejorative, right, inhuman sense. The Door has a similar feeling.
Thank you for this tip. I've been trying to post links in the chat to some of the organizations we've named in passing, just and references, just so our audience can look into it themselves. They have a chance. As we're approaching sort of a finish line right now, I wanted to kind of move towards wrapping up by raising questions similar to how we ended the last panel, and asking, what do you all think, now that we've heard from all of you on all these super lucid concepts of how we might think about institutions, how you figure your work in this way to Tosquelles and the broader aspect of having a Tosquelles exhibit at an art museum, like what, because very much when I'm hearing about all these asylum questions, it feels like it could be, perhaps there's a certain bias, framed as like an aesthetic question or an aesthetic issue, but more broadly, I would just love to hear any near final thoughts you all have. Tosquelles.
Well, I guess the first thought I have is kind of relates back to this youth question, right? Which is that for Tosquelles, and I think all of the institutional psychotherapists, the kind of the institutional, the societal, and the individual psyche, right, are like deeply intertwined, right? So, so what? I guess like you, one aspect is like I don't think like an approach that only targets one or the other can work for that reason. But I mean, the youth question is important because in terms of, I mean, our program, for instance, is targeting young adults, right? What's the reason for that? Well, I mean, there's lots of reasons for it. Some of them are economic, but the main reason is because when someone's been institutionalized, they're forever changed by that experience. If somebody spent 15 years in a psychiatric hospital, they're not the person that they went in being, and the chances of getting back to that are very slim, I guess. So so I think it is important to be thinking about the ways that institutional change and psychic change can be thought together, and that I don't know, I'll stop there.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great comment. Lauren?
Yeah, I was thinking too, the institutional psychotherapists were also critical of anti-psychiatry. And I think critical not of, as you pointed out, Dr. Ben-Moshe, that not a sort of caricature, but what they saw, for example, in the work of R.D. Laing was, after the end of the institution, he established a program that was not so unlike the moral therapy that was described, that just reconfigured a kind of family unit, in the language of Guattari is sort of the re-Oedipalization of power. And I think, Foucault was mentioned earlier as well, we have to, sort of always be thinking about the way power gets redistributed, including in sort of progressive and reform efforts after the end of certain institutions. And I think that's something that they really analyzed quite well. That said, the other critique of anti-psychiatry was that they did believe that there was also a subjective crisis to a subjective alienation, not merely a social alienation. And that's the work of, that's the analytic work, that's the therapeutic work. And just to echo Matthew's point, I mean, I think being able to think those things together, especially when we're trying to envision sort of a post-carceral world, we have to think both of them together, right? And I think that's been part of the problem of deinstitutionalization, not just all the political and economic extraction of labor, for example, or abandonment, but also a certain failure of ethics and a certain kind of therapeutic or analytic ethics, which accounts for subjective alienation as well, and not just social alienation.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, I think this dual account of the involving the subjective alienation as well is super important. Makes me think again of the youth issue, as was mentioned in the chat. Likewise, it also makes me think of wonder about this approach in relation to, maybe I'm asking for a sort of pragmatic solution or approach here, or guidance in raising it this way, which is with Professor Ben-Moshe's conclusion about you hearing these calls for asylum, like what does a response, I mean, there were some in the conclusion mentioned here, but I was thinking, I was curious to hear more of what your thoughts on institutional psychotherapy were with regards to the contemporary predicament of the what is to be done issue in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what's really interesting is how would something like that would have been implemented. And the reason why I'm saying in the US, the reason why I'm saying would and not now is because, of course, the climate is severely different, but also I think what I took from kind of learning more about Tosquelles in preparation for the symposium and just in general, and the reason why I'm saying that is because I don't speak French. So, the availability of materials that was allowed by this exhibit, and recent translations, thanks to everybody that's been a part of that, kind of enabled that. And I want to shout out Sasha Warren's book, Storming Bedlam, as well, is another site that really did a lot of work to uncover a lot of stuff around Tosquelles. But I think we need to engage with fascism, y'all. That's what I think. And I think that, I think we need to really continue the thread that was started on the last panel, where we talked about Fanon in relation to what's going on in Palestine. I think we are in times that are very similar, very unfortunately, as the times in which, Tosquelles was not just working, but I'm talking about the times that he was incarcerated, as a partisan. And I think that it's not a coincidence that a lot of people in institutional psychiatry were, came from that perspective into the world of institutional psychiatry. I think that is the world we are in now. I'm not into, and I actually am pretty sure Bazzaglia and Tosquelles and others would agree with me that we should never import, something and kind of like flop it. They were, against the glorification of their own self in this as well. But I do think that we need to think about, as people who are either in Mad Movement, institutional psychotherapy, any kind of psychotherapy, really the kind of connection to radical thinking movements, revolutionary, thinking movements, what's going on now, outside of our windows, the Palestine encampments and so on. I don't think it's like divorced, and particularly from the time frame that created the movement for institutional psychotherapy. That was it, right? It was fascism, it was war, it was colonialism. I think it's really important not to divorce that from what they said about psychiatry and as psychiatrists.
Yeah, well said. It kind of brings us, in some sense, I think, full kind of to where we began to, with this determination of the reality of institutions by the persistence of, as we had mentioned earlier in the case of Dr. Summers's presentation, like the persistence of racist ideas, like determining institutions. And in some sense, when throughout, as you just spoke about, Dr. Ben-Moshe, about fascism and colonialism, I was thinking to even earlier, like Enlightenment, even racist ideas involved in the Enlightenment and the historical lineage of like the 18th century. We could, how far back do we want to go? But there we have even some pretty early works attesting to some aspects of this history in the show from very early 19th century. And so because Dr. Summers, you began with discussing some of the earlier phenomena, I'm curious how you see the persistence or transformation of some of the ideas you mentioned, specifically in relation to this institutional asylum form. Like, why did that form develop in tandem with some of like the racist presuppositions? Or it's a very broad question, but I would be curious to hear what you think about this persistence that you described.
Well, two things come to mind, and I think this speaks to a comment that you made earlier. I mean, in some ways, I do think that the microcosm, the asylum is a microcosm of society, right? From psychiatrists' perspectives, or at least psychiatrists who were working with Black people in the 19th century, the idea is, okay, we need to re-socialize them in order for them to play the role that is expected of them based on our ideas about what Black people should be and should do, right? So I mean, I think that really informed, obviously, the kind of the therapeutic, or the logic of the therapeutic paradigm to which they were subjected. But I also think that there's another interesting persistence, and this is kind of the thinking about what constitutes Black madness to begin with. And so in the late 19th century, once psychiatrists are actually acknowledged that Black people are capable of becoming insane, there is this belief that they are more susceptible to mania than to melancholia, right? And this is when you've got this kind of tripart nosology of insanity: mania, melancholia, and dementia. And so there's this disproportionate diagnosis of Black people as suffering from mania rather than melancholia, right? And so, and if you kind of think about what mania, the symptoms of mania, erratic behavior, being very aggressive, violent, there's a very kind of extroverted expression, right, of or extroverted presentation of these symptoms, as opposed to melancholia, which is much more kind of introverted and more gloomy, certainly not engaging in any erratic or violent behavior. And I think that then reinforced this idea of, or this reinforces narrative of Black people as being naturally prone to criminality, naturally being prone to engaging in violent behavior. And then I think, as Jonathan Metzl has demonstrated, when you have the redefinition of the diagnostic criteria of schizophrenia, right, in the 60s, and it becomes associated with violent and aggressive behavior, then you begin to see this kind of disproportionate diagnosis of African American, particularly African American men, as schizophrenic. Because the records that I was using at St. Elizabeth's were covered by HIPAA regulations, I actually did not look at any records that went beyond the 1930s and 1940s. But I think that if I had, I probably would have seen the same thing that I would have found the same thing that Jonathan Metzl did, is that the Black patients being reclassified from kind of psychopathic personality to schizophrenia in the 50s and in 60s, or primarily in the 60s. But I didn't look at patient records going up that far. So
I'm very glad you mentioned that, because I had made a note as you were speaking about wanting to hear more about the specificity of that category with all of its sort of facade of scientificity to it. And yes, yeah, thank you. That was very illuminating with regards to the large-scale trajectory of these ideas.
Thank you so much, AD and everyone. It's time to wrap up. It's already 5:30. I know we could have continued this conversation for so much longer.